Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The rhythmic tapping of Rachel's keyboard was the only sound in her quiet apartment, the glow of her laptop screen casting sharp shadows against the walls as she worked through another late night. The project deadline was looming, and she was running on caffeine and determination, her focus sharp despite the exhaustion pulling at the edges of her mind. She had always been the responsible one, the one who took care of things, the one who never let anything slip through the cracks, even when it meant sacrificing her own comfort for the sake of others. Her phone buzzed on the desk beside her, the screen lighting up with a message from her coworker, Emily, a woman she had known for years and trusted implicitly. Rachel barely glanced at it at first, assuming it was just a work-related update, something minor, something she could check later. But then the second message came through, followed by a third, each one more urgent than the last. Rachel, are you seeing this? Check Facebook. Now. I swear to God, I'm about to drive to your house and slap the phone out of your hands if you don't look. A cold sense of unease crept into Rachel's spine, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as her pulse quickened, an instinctive warning flaring in the back of her mind. She reached for her phone with measured hesitation, unlocking it with a slow swipe of her thumb before tapping into her notifications. And there it was, a live video link with the caption, Sunday Family Dinner. You won't believe what Linda just said. Her stomach twisted sharply at the sight of her cousin Bethany's name attached to the post, a creeping dread settling heavy in her chest as she reluctantly clicked the link. The video opened instantly, the sound kicking in mid-laughter, the camera shaking slightly as Bethany adjusted her angle, capturing the dinner table from the far end, where Rachel's mother, Linda, sat at the center of attention. Rachel barely had time to process the scene before she heard her own name spill from her mother's lips, her voice loud and animated, dripping with amusement as she spoke. Rachel thinks she's so important just because she pays my medical bills. Poor thing doesn't realize throwing money at me won't make up for the fact that she's alone and miserable. The room erupted into laughter, forks clinking against plates, wine glasses tipping back in casual enjoyment, the kind of laughter that cut deep, that held no warmth, no kindness, no trace of affection. Rachel's fingers clenched around her phone, her breath caught somewhere between her ribs, a strange mixture of nausea and disbelief rolling through her stomach like a slow-moving wave. She knew, deep down, she had always known, that her mother wasn't the grateful, struggling woman she pretended to be whenever she needed something. She knew that the sacrifices she made, the bills she covered, the support she provided, were never truly appreciated, only expected, only taken for granted. But hearing it said out loud, hearing the cruelty in her mother's voice, hearing the way she dismissed Rachel's entire existence as nothing more than a pathetic attempt to buy love, hearing the way her family laughed along like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard, that was something else entirely. Bethany, the ever-eager instigator, leaned closer to the camera, her voice practically giddy with amusement. Right? She's, like, one cat away from being a full cliché. More laughter. More clinking glasses. More casual cruelty, thrown around like a joke that had no consequences, like Rachel herself wasn't sitting there, watching in real time, listening to them mock her without a second thought. Her mother didn't stop there. She works all those hours, makes all that money, and for what? A big empty apartment and a bunch of takeout containers in the fridge? She's wasting her life. Maybe if she stopped trying to play the hero and started focusing on finding a man, she wouldn't be so miserable. Rachel couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't believe what she was hearing. Every late-night phone call where Linda had sobbed about overdue medical bills, every emergency where Rachel had stepped in and saved her from eviction, every sacrificed vacation, every postponed plan. Every single time she had put her mother's needs before her own, this was what she got in return. Not gratitude. Not love. Not even the bare minimum of respect. Just laughter. Just humiliation, broadcast to the world. The worst part wasn't even the words themselves. It wasn't even the betrayal. It was the fact that they were enjoying it. The fact that they saw no harm in what they were saying, that they never once considered the possibility that Rachel might see this, that Rachel might finally realize the truth, that to them, she was nothing more than a punchline. Her fingers felt numb as she hovered over the screen, watching as Bethany panned the camera around the table, catching the grinning faces of uncles and aunts, of cousins she hadn't seen in months, of the people who should have, at the very least, defended her. Not a single person looked uncomfortable. Not a single person stopped Linda from speaking. Not a single person thought to say, "Hey, maybe this is cruel." Rachel inhaled slowly, forcing the shaking in her hands to still, forcing the raw anger pressing against her ribs to settle, forcing herself to remember who the hell she was. She wasn't desperate. She wasn't pathetic. And she sure as hell wasn't going to let this slide. With a calmness that felt almost foreign, she pressed her thumb to the screen, hitting block on Bethany's account, then her mother's, then every single person tagged in the video. Then, just as quickly, she opened her banking app, her movements slow and deliberate, her expression unreadable as she navigated to the section that controlled her mother's finances. It took less than a minute. A single tap. A single canceled automatic payment. And just like that, Linda Morgan's safety net was gone. Rachel set her phone down, exhaling as she stared at the now black screen, the reflection of her own face barely visible in the dim light of her apartment. She should have been shaking. She should have been crying. She should have been hurting. But all she felt was clarity. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, Rachel woke up to the familiar glow of sunlight filtering through her bedroom curtains, but this time, instead of feeling the usual weight of obligation pressing against her chest, she felt something else entirely, a sharp, unwavering sense of control. The events of the previous night had played over in her mind on an endless loop, each word her mother had spoken, each cruel laugh from her family members, each moment of that humiliating live stream embedding itself into her memory like a permanent scar. But now, as she lay there, staring at the ceiling, she realized something with a clarity that cut straight through the lingering sting of betrayal. She was done. No more late-night emergency calls from her mother claiming she couldn't afford rent. No more frantic texts from Bethany whining about her overdue car payments. No more guilt trips disguised as family obligations. With that decision made, Rachel pushed back the blankets and swung her legs over the side of the bed, moving with a deliberate slowness, letting the moment settle around her, letting herself absorb the reality of what she was about to do. She reached for her phone, unlocking it with steady fingers, navigating straight to her banking app with the efficiency of someone who had been handling financial disasters for far too long. Her mother's rent? Cancelled. Her mother's prescription refills? Cancelled. Her mother's utility bills? Cancelled. Bethany's car loan, the one Rachel had stupidly co-signed for after listening to a sob story about how she just needed help one time? Cancelled. For the first time in 6 years, every single financial obligation Rachel had been covering for them was gone. At first, there was silence, no immediate reaction, no instant messages, no desperate phone calls, nothing to indicate that the bomb she had just dropped on their cushy, entitled world had even registered yet. She got dressed, made coffee, even enjoyed the rare piece of her morning routine without the usual interruptions that came with managing other people's crises. But she knew it was only a matter of time before the chaos began. The first message came in barely 2 hours later, Bethany's name flashing across her screen with the kind of urgency that almost made Rachel laugh. WTF, Rachel? Mom's card just got declined at the pharmacy. Fix this. Rachel smirked, sipping her coffee, not even bothering to reply right away. She let Bethany sit in that panic, let her feel the confusion, let her scramble for an explanation, let her deal with the fallout of not having a guaranteed safety net to fall back on. Then, as expected, came the message from her mother, short, cold, entitled, completely devoid of any self-awareness. I don't know what happened, but my accounts are all frozen. Fix this. Rachel actually laughed this time, shaking her head at the sheer audacity of it all. The fact that Linda didn't even consider that Rachel might have been the one to cut her off, the fact that she had so completely convinced herself that Rachel's financial support was an inalienable right rather than a choice, was almost comical. With deliberate amusement, Rachel finally typed out her response, keeping it short, sharp, and brutal. "Not my problem. Maybe ask Bethany to livestream a fundraiser for you." She hit send, setting her phone down on the counter, waiting for the inevitable explosion that would follow. And, right on cue, her phone lit up with an incoming call from her mother, followed by another, then a voicemail notification, each one arriving in rapid succession like some kind of pathetic, desperate SOS. Rachel took her time before playing the voicemail, letting the anticipation build, letting the satisfaction settle into her bones, letting herself enjoy the reversal of power for the first time in her life. Then, finally, she pressed play. Her mother's voice came through, thick with barely restrained fury, laced with just enough false victimhood to try and manipulate her into caving. "Rachel, what the hell do you think you're doing? You can't just cut me off like this. After everything I've done for you? You think you can just pull the rug out from under your own mother and sleep at night? Let me tell you something, young lady. You are going to regret this. I promise you that." Rachel let the message play to the very end, then calmly deleted it, her expression unreadable as she set her phone down and finished her coffee. Regret? No, she didn't think so. If anything, she had never felt more sure of herself in her entire life. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Rachel experienced what could only be described as peace, a kind of quiet, weightless existence that came from finally severing ties with the people who had done nothing but drain her for years. A full week passed with no texts, no demands, no sudden emergencies that somehow always seemed to require her money, no entitled phone calls filled with thinly veiled insults disguised as parental concern. She woke up each morning with a strange, almost foreign sense of freedom, knowing she owed nothing to anyone, knowing that her hard-earned money was finally hers to spend as she pleased, knowing that the life she had built for herself would no longer be leached away by people who never truly appreciated it. But, as expected, the silence did not last. It started with a voicemail, left sometime in the early hours of the morning, the timestamp showing it had come through at exactly 2:43 a.m., a time when desperation had clearly overridden whatever sense of pride Linda had left. Rachel had ignored the call, unwilling to break her streak of not caring, but something about the sheer persistence of her mother's attempts made her curious enough to press play. The moment Linda's voice filled the room, Rachel nearly rolled her eyes. "Rachel, sweetheart, a sharp inhale, a calculated tremble. I just don't understand how you could do this to me. I'm your mother. I gave you life. I raised you. I sacrificed for you, and now you're just going to throw me away like I'm nothing?" A loud, wet sob followed, the kind that would have been more convincing if Rachel hadn't heard it 100 times before, usually when money was tight and the water bill was due. "I just don't know how I'm supposed to survive without you. I don't have anyone else. Please, Rachel, don't let me suffer like this. You're all I have." Rachel almost laughed at the sheer theatricality of it all, at the way her mother always seemed to turn herself into the tragic victim of every situation, at the way she conveniently forgot all the times Rachel had given and given and given while receiving absolutely nothing in return. There was a time, years ago, when a message like that would have made her stomach twist, would have filled her with guilt, would have made her scramble to fix things. But now? Now it just sounded exhausting. She deleted the voicemail without responding. Then, a few hours later, came the text from Bethany, the first sign that the let's guilt trip Rachel into submission strategy was now shifting into full-blown gaslighting. "Look, I know Mom said some messed up stuff, but you have to admit you totally overreacted. She was just venting. You know how she is. She didn't mean any of it." Rachel narrowed her eyes at the message, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she tried to decide whether it was even worth responding. Then, before she could type a single word, another text popped up. "I was just joking too, by the way. You took it way too seriously. You always do this. You make everything such a big deal. And there it was, the classic "you're too sensitive" move, the same tired, manipulative nonsense she had been fed her entire life, the same attempt to make her question her own emotions, her own right to be angry. Rachel let out a breath, shaking her head slowly, her irritation settling into something much colder, something much sharper, something that felt dangerously close to amusement. Because if they thought guilt was going to work, and if they thought gaslighting was going to work, they were in for a very, very rude awakening. A few days passed with nothing, no new messages, no further attempts to manipulate her, no additional pleas for money or mercy. Rachel had almost convinced herself that maybe, just maybe, they had finally accepted reality, that maybe they had finally understood she wasn't going to be their personal ATM anymore, that maybe they had finally learned their lesson. Then came the message that shattered that illusion completely. Linda, in all her delusional, entitled glory, sent a text so bold, so unbelievably audacious, that Rachel actually had to reread it 3 times just to make sure she wasn't hallucinating. I was thinking, maybe I should come live with you for a while? Just until I get back on my feet. It would only be temporary. Maybe 6 months, a year at most. I mean, you have that big apartment all to yourself, and you're always so busy working, so you probably wouldn't even notice me most of the time. Just let me know when I can start moving things over. Rachel's entire body locked up, her grip on the phone tightening, her jaw going slack, her mind racing with the sheer audacity of it all. Her mother, the same woman who had called her a desperate failure, the same woman who had mocked her, humiliated her, laughed at her expense in front of an audience, now wanted to move in with her? Rachel felt the laugh bubble up in her throat before she could stop it, a sharp, disbelieving sound that broke through the stillness of her apartment like a crack of thunder. She didn't respond. She didn't even acknowledge it. She simply blocked the number and moved on with her day. But then, later that night, something happened that changed everything. Rachel was lying on her couch, scrolling through emails, sipping on a well-earned glass of wine, when her phone vibrated with a new message from an unknown number. It was a voice note. Curious, she tapped play. Bethany's voice came through, low, irritated, completely unaware that Rachel was listening. Just apologize, get her to pay again, then cut her off once she gives in. She always gives in. Rachel's blood ran cold. The stupidity of it was almost impressive. Bethany had clearly meant to send that to Linda, not to Rachel, and in doing so, had just confirmed everything Rachel already knew deep in her gut. They didn't care. They never had. And they had no intention of changing. Rachel sat there in silence, the weight of the betrayal settling in a way that felt strangely final. Because now, she was really done playing nice. Rachel sat in the dim glow of her apartment, staring at the last message she had received from Bethany, the one that had confirmed every suspicion she had ever held, the one that had made it crystal clear that nothing would ever change, that these people, her own blood, had never seen her as anything more than an easy target. There had been a time when hearing something like that would have crushed her, a time when she might have spent days agonizing over where she had gone wrong, over whether she had somehow driven them to this, over whether she should just swallow her pride and give them what they wanted to keep the peace. But now, as she sat there, her glass of wine resting in one hand, her phone in the other, she felt nothing but a slow-burning satisfaction, the kind that came with knowing you were about to turn the tables. If they thought she was going to roll over and let them walk all over her again, they were in for a rude awakening. With a calm, almost detached sense of amusement, Rachel tapped out a message, deliberately keeping her tone light, almost apologetic, almost as if she were the one who had something to make up for. I've been thinking, and maybe I overreacted. I don't want things to be like this between us. Let's talk over dinner. My treat. She hit send, setting her phone down and taking another slow sip of wine, knowing exactly how this would play out before it even happened. Bethany would see it first, immediately forwarding it to Linda, immediately gloating, immediately assuming they had won. They would think she had cracked, that the guilt had finally eaten away at her, that she had realized she couldn't live without them, that she was finally coming back into the fold where she belonged. And just as expected, they responded within minutes. Bethany, ever the smug opportunist, wasted no time pretending to be magnanimous. I'm glad you're finally seeing reason. We'll be there. Hope you're ready to make things right. Rachel almost rolled her eyes at the sheer arrogance of it. Linda's message was no better, though she at least tried to mask her entitlement with fake motherly concern. Of course, sweetheart. Families have disagreements sometimes, but we always come back to each other. I just want us to move forward. Rachel smirked, shaking her head as she typed back a single word. Exactly. They thought she was giving in. They had no idea she was setting them up. The next day, Rachel made a reservation at one of the most expensive restaurants in the city, a place where even a single appetizer cost more than what Bethany probably had in her bank account. She reserved a private dining room, ensuring they would have complete privacy for what was about to unfold, making sure there would be no escape, no distractions, no convenient ways for them to twist the situation into something it wasn't. When the evening arrived, she arrived early, dressed in an effortlessly elegant black dress, the kind that exuded confidence, the kind that told the world she was someone who had her life together. She ordered a bottle of the finest wine on the menu, letting the waiter pour a glass as she leaned back in her chair, perfectly composed, perfectly relaxed, perfectly in control. Then, right on schedule, they walked in. Bethany was first, dressed in something trendy but cheap, her smile wide, her eyes gleaming with triumph, her entire demeanor practically radiating victory. Linda followed close behind, wearing her usual carefully curated expression of gentle concern, the mask of a mother who wanted nothing more than to reconcile with her wayward daughter, the mask of a woman who had never once in her life taken responsibility for her own actions. Rachel stood, greeting them with a warm, practiced smile, letting them believe the lie, letting them bask in the illusion of their success. Bethany sat first, immediately reaching for the wine, pouring herself a generous glass without hesitation. Linda followed suit, sighing dramatically as she took her seat, her eyes scanning Rachel's face, searching for any sign of lingering resentment, any sign that she might still be harboring anger over what had happened. Rachel gave them nothing. Instead, she called for the waiter, letting them order whatever they wanted, encouraging them to indulge, to enjoy, to believe they had truly won. And they did. They laughed, they drank, they ate without restraint, throwing out the occasional passive-aggressive comment about how Rachel had always been too stubborn for her own good, about how they had always known she would come to her senses, about how they could finally put everything behind them now that she had done the right thing. Rachel simply smiled, letting them dig their own graves with every entitled word. And then, just as the evening was winding down, just as Linda reached for the dessert menu, just as Bethany leaned back in her chair with the satisfied air of someone who had successfully manipulated her way back into free money, the check arrived. Rachel picked it up, holding it between her fingers, letting the moment stretch, letting them bask in their own delusions for just a little longer. Then, with a slow, deliberate smirk, she set the bill down in the center of the table, leaned back in her chair, and said, "So, which one of you is paying?" For a few seconds, neither of them spoke, the weight of Rachel's words hanging thick in the air between them, the once lively, victorious atmosphere at the table now replaced by a tense, suffocating silence. Linda's hand, which had been lazily reaching for her wine glass just moments ago, froze in midair, her fingers tightening around the delicate stem as her eyes flicked down to the bill resting on the table. Across from her, Bethany, who had been basking in the false security of what she believed to be Rachel's surrender, suddenly stiffened, her smug expression faltering, her carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. Linda blinked at the check, her face slowly draining of color as her mind worked to catch up with what was happening, her carefully rehearsed lines of motherly affection slipping through the cracks of her rapidly crumbling confidence. With a forced chuckle, she pushed the bill slightly toward Rachel, her smile tense, her voice overly sweet in that way it always was when she was trying to manipulate her way out of an uncomfortable situation. "Rachel, sweetie, you invited us," she said, her tone coated in artificial warmth, the same condescending patience she had used Rachel's entire life, the same tone that had always implied Rachel should feel grateful just to be in her presence. Rachel leaned back, fingers idly tracing the rim of her wine glass, allowing the moment to stretch, allowing them to feel every ounce of discomfort creeping up their spines. She tilted her head slightly, giving her mother an almost pitying smile before speaking, her voice calm, controlled, laced with something sharp beneath the surface. "Right," Rachel mused, her lips curling slightly. "But I'm a desperate failure, remember? Why would I pay for dinner?" The second the words left her mouth, Linda's expression shattered. Across the table, Bethany sucked in a sharp breath, her eyes darting toward Linda as if waiting for her to fix this, to smooth it over, to regain control of a situation that had already slipped completely through their fingers. Linda's smile, though faltering, remained, her lips twitching slightly at the edges as she let out a strained laugh, as if still holding onto the hope that this was all just a cruel joke, as if still believing she could talk her way out of this. "Rachel, don't be ridiculous," she said, the first hint of irritation creeping into her voice, the first sign of the panic that was steadily rising in her chest. "It was just talk. You know how we joke around." Rachel held up a single finger, effectively silencing her. Then, with deliberate slowness, she reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, unlocked it with ease, and scrolled to a very specific voicemail. The one Bethany had sent by mistake. She tapped play, and in an instant, Bethany's own voice filled the private dining room, echoing across the table, every word dripping with the very same arrogance that had led them to believe they could manipulate Rachel back into submission. Just apologize, get her to pay again, then cut her off once she gives in. She always gives in. The second the recording ended, Bethany's entire body went rigid. Linda's mouth fell open slightly, her hands gripping the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her face twisted into something Rachel had never quite seen before, pure, unfiltered panic. The waiter, who had approached the table to check in on them, now stood a few feet away, shifting awkwardly as he took in the scene before him, his eyes darting between Rachel's composed expression and the growing horror spreading across Linda's face. Rachel finally set her phone down, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle on her dress before lifting her gaze to meet Bethany's. "You know," Rachel said thoughtfully, tapping a manicured finger against the table, "for someone who thinks I always give in, you really should have been more careful about what you said out loud." Bethany swallowed hard, her breathing uneven, her hands fidgeting in her lap as she struggled to find the right words, as she scrambled to come up with an excuse, as she fought to regain control of something that had already spiraled far beyond her reach. Linda, still in shock, slowly turned to face Bethany, her lips parting as she exhaled a sharp breath, the weight of her own daughter's betrayal sinking in at a rapid, unforgiving pace. You actually said that?" Linda whispered, her voice a mix of disbelief and rage, her hands still trembling slightly as she clenched them into fists. Bethany's eyes darted wildly between them, her desperation evident now, her usual self-assured demeanor completely obliterated as she stammered out a response. "I didn't mean it like that," she blurted, her voice shrill, cracking under the weight of her own exposed schemes. "I was just, Rachel, come on, I was just frustrated. You weren't listening to us, you were being stubborn," and Rachel sighed, standing up from her chair with a sense of finality, pulling 2 crisp dollar bills from her purse and dropping them onto the table with deliberate ease. "Here," she said, glancing at the waiter with a smirk. "That should cover their tip." Then, turning back to Linda and Bethany, she crossed her arms, giving them both a look that held no sympathy, no forgiveness, no hesitation. "The bill," Rachel continued, her voice sharp, firm, final, "is on you." Bethany's mouth opened and closed, her face now a sickly shade of red, her fingers curling into her lap as she tried to process the public humiliation unraveling before her very eyes. "You're being cruel," Linda finally hissed, her voice low, venomous, a last-ditch attempt to turn the blame back onto Rachel, to frame herself as the victim in a situation she had entirely created. Rachel simply smiled, tilting her head slightly as she reached for her purse, slinging it over her shoulder in one fluid motion. "Oh, I'm just getting started," she mused, amusement flickering in her gaze as she gestured toward Bethany's phone. "See, I told a few people to tune in, and I think you'll enjoy the irony." Bethany's entire body went stiff, her hands shaking slightly as she grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she unlocked it, her eyes widening as she scrolled through the flood of incoming messages. Rachel had sent the live stream to Bethany's employer, her boyfriend, and their entire extended family, ensuring that everyone they had ever tried to impress now had a front-row seat to their well-deserved downfall. Bethany gasped, her voice a choked mix of rage and horror. Before she could finish, Rachel was already walking away, the sharp click of her heels the only sound that filled the room as she strode toward the exit, never once looking back, never once hesitating, never once second-guessing herself. And just as she reached the door, just as she stepped over the threshold, just as she breathed in the crisp, liberating air of freedom, Bethany's voice rang out behind her, shrill and furious, cracking under the weight of her own defeat. "You ruined my life." Rachel didn't pause. She didn't turn around. She didn't acknowledge them. She just kept walking.